Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are days that belong to a nation, days so thoroughly claimed by the mythology of a people that the actual history underneath them can be difficult to see clearly, buried under 2 centuries of celebration and rhetoric, and the particular kind of reverence that democracies direct toward their founding moments. The 4th of July is one of those days. Americans grow up knowing it, or thinking they know it. The Declaration, the Liberty Bell, fireworks, summer heat, the birth of a nation, and all of that is real in its way. But the history underneath the celebration is richer, stranger, more violent, more morally complicated, and more contingent than the mythology suggests. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 were not inevitable heroes. They were people making a bet that could very easily have gone wrong, that most informed observers of the period thought would go wrong, and that had consequences for themselves, for the people they governed, for the people they did not govern, and for the structure of the world, that none of them fully anticipated, and some of them would have found deeply troubling. Tonight we're going to tell the whole story. Not just the day itself, though we will get to the day, and to the specific details of what happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 that are genuinely remarkable, and that the ceremonial version of events tends to flatten. We're going to start earlier, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, in the specific decisions that the British government made between 1763 and 1775 that converted a loyal colonial population into an armed revolutionary movement. We are going to follow the argument from the Stamp Act to the Boston Massacre to the Tea Party to Lexington and Concord, understanding how each escalation made the next one more likely, and how the revolution came to seem, to the people living through it, not like a choice but like a conclusion they had been driven to. Then we're going to follow the war itself. 8 years of fighting from the frozen crossing of the Delaware to the naval campaign at Yorktown that ended it, with the attention it deserves as one of the most complex and consequential military conflicts of the 18th century. And then we're going to look at what the revolution left behind. The Constitution, the compromises, the promises made and the promises deferred, the world that the Declaration of Independence brought into being and the gap between what it claimed and what it delivered. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, drop your city and your local time in the comments. There is something that still moves me about knowing this is reaching different parts of the world at the same time. Some of you in the small hours and some of you at the end of a long day. Now dim the lights. Let the room go soft. Find a comfortable position. Let the breath slow down and let us go back, all the way back, to the moment when the British Empire reached its greatest extent and began, without knowing it, to plant the seeds of its first great loss. Before we arrive at the crisis of the 1760s, it is worth understanding the colonial world that the crisis disrupted. Not the mythology of the founding, but the actual texture of colonial American life in the mid-18th century. Because the revolution was not made in abstraction. It was made by specific people with specific material lives and specific grievances, and the world they were living in shaped both their complaints and their capacity to organize against them. The 13 colonies that ran from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south were not a unified society with a common identity. They were 13 separate political entities with distinct histories, distinct economies, distinct religious cultures, and distinct relationships to the mother country, held together by the shared fact of British colonial authority and the shared fact of being on the same continent, which was a weaker kind of unity than the subsequent revolution would make it appear. New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, was a world of small towns and subsistence farming supplemented by fishing, shipbuilding and the Atlantic carrying trade, with a congregationalist religious culture that had given the region a high literacy rate, a tradition of town meeting democracy, and a ferocious independent-mindedness that the British repeatedly underestimated. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, were more ethnically and religiously diverse, with large Dutch, German, and Scots-Irish populations alongside the English, and economies that combined farming with the substantial commercial activity of Philadelphia and New York, the two largest cities in the colonies. The southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, were dominated by the plantation economy, by the tobacco and rice and indigo that enslaved labour produced, and by a planter aristocracy whose specific self-image, classical learning, landed gentry, Roman civic virtue combined with Greek democratic forms, shaped the peculiar character of southern colonial politics. The population of the colonies in 1770 was approximately 2.1 million free people, plus approximately 460,000 enslaved people, for a total of roughly 2.5 million, about a third of the population of Britain itself. It was a population growing at an extraordinary rate, doubling approximately every 25 years through a combination of natural increase in immigration, and that growth rate was visible to anyone paying attention as the foundation of a future power whose potential the more prescient British observers found genuinely alarming even before the political crisis developed. Benjamin Franklin had been calculating the implications of colonial population growth since the 1750s and predicting that within a century the population of British North America would exceed that of Britain itself, a prediction that proved approximately correct and that contributed to his sense that the colonial relationship with Britain had to be restructured on different terms if it was going to survive. The economy of the colonies was substantially agricultural. Perhaps 90% of the population lived and worked on farms. But it was not a subsistence economy. Colonial farmers produced surpluses that entered the Atlantic commercial system through a network of merchants in the coastal cities who connected the interior agricultural production to the markets of Britain, the Caribbean, southern Europe, and the Wine Islands. The specific commercial regulations that governed this trade, the Navigation Acts, which required that colonial trade move on British ships and pass through British ports, were a persistent irritant that the colonists had developed considerable skill in evading through smuggling, which was so widespread and so openly practiced in many ports that it had ceased to be thought of as a crime and was considered instead a reasonable response to unreasonable regulation. The social structure of colonial America was more fluid than that of Britain or Europe, but less egalitarian than the mythology of the founding suggests. There were genuine elites, the planters of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, the merchant families of Boston and Philadelphia and New York, the great Dutch landowners of the Hudson Valley, whose wealth and social position were as entrenched as those of the English gentry, and who exercised political power through the colonial assemblies with a confidence that derived from their control of land, credit, and the mechanisms of colonial government. Below them was a large and genuinely middling class of independent farmers and artisans and small merchants, the yeoman farmer ideal that Jefferson and others would make the ideological foundation of the Republic, and below them a labouring class of indentured servants, free labourers, sailors, and the urban poor whose participation in the political life of the colonial period was more limited than the universal-sounding rhetoric of rights and liberty suggested. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with Britain standing astride the world in a way that no European power had managed before. The Treaty of Paris that concluded it gave Britain Canada from France, Florida from Spain, and dominance over the Indian subcontinent that the Battle of Plassey in 1757 had initiated. It was the culmination of a century of colonial competition, and the map of the world that emerged from it was a map in which British red covered an extraordinary and unprecedented extent of territory. The 13 American colonies that ran down the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts to Georgia had been part of this British effort. Colonial militias had fought alongside British regulars in the North American theatre, and a young Virginia officer named George Washington had served in the early campaigns before the professional British Army largely displaced the colonial forces in the later stages of the war. But the victory had a price, and the price was the central fact around which the entire pre-revolutionary crisis would turn. The national debt of Great Britain had approximately doubled during the 7 Years' War, reaching about £130 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for the period, serviced at a cost that consumed more than half of annual government revenue just in interest payments. The enormous new empire that the war had produced was also enormously expensive to maintain. Garrison troops had to be stationed in Canada, in the newly acquired Florida, along the Appalachian frontier where the Peace of Paris had drawn a line prohibiting colonial settlement west of the mountains, the Proclamation Line of 1763, intended to prevent the colonial frontier conflicts with indigenous nations that had been a persistent drain on British military resources. Maintaining the military establishments required for this expanded empire cost money that the existing British tax base could not easily supply. The logic that seemed obvious to the British government, under the ministries of George Grenville and then the Marquis of Rockingham, and then the Duke of Grafton and eventually Lord North, was straightforward. The colonies had been defended at British expense, had benefited enormously from the war's outcome. Canada neutralised, the French interior threat eliminated, the continent's eastern seaboard secured for British commercial development, and could reasonably be asked to contribute to the cost of the military establishments that continued to protect them. This seemed, to people sitting in London, so obviously reasonable that the colonial objection to it was initially received with genuine incomprehension. Of course, the colonists should pay. They were British subjects. They had been defended. They were prospering. The idea that they would refuse to contribute to the cost of their own defence was, to the British political establishment, evidence of ingratitude and selfishness rather than of principle. The colonies had a completely different understanding of the situation, rooted in a different constitutional tradition and a different experience of what British governance actually looked like from their side of the Atlantic. The colonial assemblies, the legislative bodies that each colony had maintained since the early periods of settlement, elected by property-owning men within each colony, controlling local taxation and local expenditure, had developed across the preceding century into the primary instruments of self-government for the colonial populations. The tradition that taxation required the consent of the taxed, expressed through elected representatives, was not an innovation of the 1760s. It was the foundation of English constitutional liberty as the colonists understood it, derived from Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution and the accumulated precedents of English constitutional history that the colonists had studied and absorbed with a thoroughness that their British critics found, when the argument got serious, inconveniently precise. The colonial argument was not that they should pay nothing, it was that they should be taxed only by their own elected assemblies, not by a parliament in which they had no representation. The British response, the argument of virtual representation, that every member of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere, not merely those who had voted for him, was received in the colonies with the derision that it probably deserved as a piece of constitutional reasoning. The colonists who had been electing their own assemblies for generations, and who had developed robust traditions of local self-government, were not impressed by the claim that they were virtually represented by men they had never voted for in a body they had never participated in, sitting 3,000 miles away. No taxation without representation was a slogan, because it was also an argument, and it was an argument that the British government never found a fully satisfying answer to. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first direct attempt by Parliament to tax the colonies for revenue rather than merely to regulate trade, and it produced a colonial reaction that genuinely surprised the British government by its intensity and its organisational sophistication. The Act imposed a tax on all printed materials in the colonies, newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, playing cards. requiring that they bear a revenue stamp purchased from government agents. It was modelled on existing British domestic taxes of similar type, and seemed to its designers a modest and defensible measure. To the colonists, it was a constitutional outrage. The response was remarkable for its speed and its effectiveness. The Stamp Act Congress, which convened in New York in October 1765 with representatives from 9 colonies, was the first intercolonial assembly ever called for political rather than military purposes, and it produced a declaration of rights and grievances that set out the colonial constitutional position with precision and clarity. More immediately effective was the organisation of non-importation agreements, boycotts of British goods coordinated across the colonies by networks of merchants and political organisations that hit British manufacturers and exporters with economic consequences they found genuinely painful. The Sons of Liberty, organised in Boston by Samuel Adams and replicated in various forms across the colonies, provided the organisational infrastructure for popular resistance, and also, less admirably, for the intimidation and sometimes violent harassment of stamp distributors that made the act practically unenforceable before it was legally repealed. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, partly because the boycotts were working and partly because the Rockingham ministry that replaced Grenville found the political fight more trouble than it was worth. But the repeal was accompanied by the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a statement of principle that the British government considered essential and that the colonists received as a threat rather than a reassurance. The Declaratory Act was the position that made every subsequent conflict inevitable, because it committed the British government to a constitutional claim that the colonial position flatly denied, and it did so just as the colonists were celebrating what they took to be a victory. The celebration was premature. The argument had not been resolved. It had only been deferred. The Townshend Acts of 1767 resumed the argument with a new set of duties, taxes on imported glass, paper, paint, and tea, designed by Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to exploit what he believed was a colonial distinction between external duties on trade, which they accepted in principle, and internal taxes like the stamp duty, which they rejected. The colonists did not accept this distinction in the way Townshend had hoped. The non-importation movements revived. The colonial press produced a flood of political argument, including John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which circulated through newspapers across the colonies and articulated the constitutional case against parliamentary taxation with a lucidity that made it the most widely read political document in colonial America before the Declaration itself. The Boston Massacre of 1770, a confrontation in which British soldiers stationed in Boston fired on a crowd that had been taunting and pelting them with ice and oyster shells, killing 5 men, provided the colonial cause with its first martyrs and its most potent propaganda image. Reproduced in an engraving by Paul Revere that depicted the soldiers firing in disciplined volleys on a helpless civilian crowd, which was not quite what had happened, but was extremely effective as political art. Most of the Townshend duties were repealed in 1770, in the same conciliatory gesture that had produced the repeal of the Stamp Act, with the same accompanying refusal to concede the constitutional principle. The duty on tea was retained specifically to maintain the assertion of parliamentary authority. The retention was a political choice of considerable significance. It kept the constitutional argument alive while reducing its economic bite to the point where many colonists were willing to accept a de facto situation that they still rejected in principle. The years between 1770 and 1773 were years of relative calm, sometimes described by historians as a period of drift, in which the revolutionary crisis might conceivably have been resolved if different decisions had been made. The decisions that were made instead converted the relative calm into the final escalation, The Boston Tea Party of December 16th, 1773 was one of the most theatrical political acts of the entire pre-revolutionary period, and its theatrical quality was not incidental but essential. It was designed to be a clear, dramatic, unambiguous statement of colonial refusal that could not be explained away or absorbed by the political system as a minor disturbance. The specific context was the Tea Act of 1773, which was actually a commercial favour to the colonies in one sense. It allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to American consumers at a price lower than they had been paying, even including the townshend duty, but which the colonial leadership read correctly as a political trap designed to make Americans accept parliamentary taxation in practice, while they continued to reject it in principle. If Americans bought the cheap taxed tea, they were conceding the point. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were not going to concede the point. On the night of December 16th, a group of men, estimates range from 30 to 116, organised in advance and dressed in Mohawk costume that was a disguise thin enough to be transparent to anyone paying attention, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbour and systematically dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. The destruction was deliberate and total. Nothing else on the ships was touched. No one was hurt. The message was precise. The tea was refused not on grounds of price, but on grounds of constitutional principle, and the colonial leadership was willing to destroy a substantial amount of property to make that point clearly. The value of the tea destroyed was approximately £10,000, a significant sum, roughly equivalent to several years' income for a skilled artisan. The British government's response to the Boston Tea Party was the response of an authority that had been publicly humiliated and that prioritised the restoration of its dignity over the maintenance of its strategic position. The coercive acts of 1774, called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, closed the port of Boston, suspended Massachusetts self-government, required colonists to quarter British troops in their homes, and allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain rather than before colonial juries. The acts were intended to isolate Massachusetts, punish Boston, and demonstrate to the other colonies that resistance to British authority had consequences that extended to the elimination of the self-governing institutions they valued most. The acts achieved none of these objectives. Instead, they galvanized the colonial response in precisely the way that the most politically astute observers, Edmund Burke in Parliament, Benjamin Franklin in London, where he was serving as colonial agent, had warned they would. The Quebec Act, passed simultaneously with the coercive acts, inflamed colonial opinion for reasons that extended beyond the immediate crisis. The act extended the boundaries of the province of Quebec south and west to the Ohio River, granted religious toleration to French Canadian Catholics, and preserved the French civil law system in Quebec. In London, these were reasonable accommodations to the reality of governing a large French Catholic population. In the Protestant colonies to the south, they were read as evidence that the British government preferred French Catholics to English Protestants, and as a deliberate move to wall off Western expansion by placing the Ohio Valley under the government of a province whose population had no tradition of English constitutional liberty. The First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, drew delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia alone did not participate, and represented the most significant exercise in intercolonial political organisation that had yet occurred. The delegates who gathered in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia were not, at this point, revolutionaries in any formal sense. Most of them still hoped for reconciliation with Britain on terms that preserved both colonial self-government and the imperial connection. But they were men who had been arguing the constitutional case for colonial rights for a decade, and who brought to Philadelphia a sophistication in political argument and organisational experience that would shape everything that followed. The Suffolk Resolves, adopted from Massachusetts and endorsed by the Congress, declared the coercive acts unconstitutional and called for their nullification. The Continental Association organized a comprehensive non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption agreement across all the colonies, and the delegates agreed to meet again the following May if their grievances had not been addressed. They had not been addressed. The British government, under Lord North, had determined that the colonial resistance had gone beyond what political accommodation could manage and required a military response. The year 1774 ended with both sides preparing for the confrontation that neither officially was willing to acknowledge was coming. The events of April 19, 1775 were the culmination of a military build-up that both sides had been conducting through the preceding months. With the awareness that the political crisis had reached the point where armed conflict was more likely than not, General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, had been watching the colonial militias of Massachusetts drill and stockpile arms and ammunition in the countryside around the city, with the combination of military concern and political helplessness of a man who knew that an order to move against the militias would produce the conflict that London still officially wanted to avoid. By April 1775, the specific intelligence that a significant quantity of colonial military stores had been accumulated at Concord, 20 miles from Boston, had become acute enough that Gage decided to act. The force he sent, approximately 700 British regulars, setting out from Boston in the early morning hours of April 19th under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, was intended to reach Concord, destroy the military stores, and return to Boston without provoking a general engagement. The colonists had been warned. Paul Revere's midnight ride on April 18th, the most famous single act of the pre-revolutionary period, the one that Longfellow's poem has burned into American cultural memory, though the poem gets several details wrong, and Revere was captured before he could complete his circuit, and the parallel ride of William Dawes, and then Samuel Prescott, who carried the warning onto Concord after Revere's capture, had roused the countryside with enough time for the Minutemen to be assembling on the Lexington Green by the time the British column arrived in the pre-dawn darkness of April 19th. The confrontation on Lexington Green was brief, confused, and immediately consequential. Approximately 77 militiamen under Captain John Parker faced the leading companies of the British column. Parker, who was badly outnumbered, had told his men, and the words have been preserved, though their exact phrasing is disputed by historians, something to the effect that they should not fire unless fired upon, but that if they meant to have a war, let it begin here. A shot was fired. By whom, from which side, in what specific circumstances, has never been definitively established and is one of the genuinely unresolvable questions of American history. The British companies opened fire. By the time the shooting stopped, 8 militiamen were dead and 10 wounded. 1 British soldier was slightly wounded. The British column continued to Concord. At Concord, the situation was different. The North Bridge crossing produced the exchange of fire that Ralph Waldo Emerson's poem would describe as the shot heard round the world. 2 British soldiers killed, several wounded, the British companies pulling back from the bridge under effective fire from a militia force that had positioned itself with tactical intelligence and discipline. The British found some military stores at Concord and destroyed what they could find, but most had already been moved. And then the return march to Boston began, and it was on that return march that the full weight of the colonial response made itself felt. The countryside had been roused. Militia companies from across eastern Massachusetts were converging on the road to Boston. The British regulars, who had been trained for the volley and advanced tactics of European linear warfare, found themselves in a running engagement unlike anything their doctrine or their experience had prepared them for. The colonial militiamen used walls and trees and buildings for cover, firing from positions of concealment at a column that could not effectively respond to an enemy it could not always see. The British return march covered 16 miles under fire and cost the column at least 73 men killed and 174 wounded, the deadliest day of combat in North America since the French and Indian War. The column was effectively saved from destruction only by the arrival of a relief force under Lord Percy near Lexington, which provided the covering fire that allowed the exhausted and shot-up advance column to reorganize and complete the march to Boston. By nightfall on April 19th, the countryside around Boston was filled with colonial militia, and Boston itself was effectively besieged. Gage's force of several thousand British regulars occupied the city, while an estimated 20,000 militia encircled it from the landward side. The war that both sides had been manoeuvring around for years had begun in a field in Lexington in the Massachusetts spring morning, with a shot that nobody claimed to have fired. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, while the siege of Boston was already underway, in circumstances that made the fiction of a purely political assembly genuinely difficult to maintain. The delegates who gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, the building that would later be called Independence Hall, were technically the representatives of colonies that were still formally part of the British Empire. They were also the de facto government of a rebellion that had just begun killing people. The tension between these two realities shaped everything about the Congress's first year. The delegates who participated in the Second Continental Congress over the following year were a remarkable group of people, remarkable in their individual abilities, their political sophistication, and the degree to which their individual personalities and ambitions shaped the decisions that history records as the collective achievements of the Revolution. John Adams of Massachusetts was perhaps the most politically acute of them, opinionated, occasionally difficult, deeply learned in constitutional history, and possessed of a judgment about men and situations that his contemporaries did not always appreciate, but that subsequent events consistently vindicated. His cousin, Samuel Adams, the master organizer of the Boston resistance, was less prominent in the Congress than in the streets of Boston, but provided a consistent pressure toward independence that the more cautious delegates found simultaneously useful and alarming. Benjamin Franklin, who had returned from London in May 1775 after years as colonial agent in Britain, was the oldest delegate at 69 and the most internationally famous American alive, a scientist of genuine distinction, a diplomat of considerable skill, and a political intelligence of unusual depth and subtlety, whose specific contributions to the revolutionary cause were often less visible than those of the orators, but arguably more consequential. Thomas Jefferson, who arrived in the Congress as a delegate from Virginia in June 1775, was 32 years old and had been in significant political life for only a few years. He was already known to his Virginia colleagues as a man of unusual intellectual range, trained as a lawyer, deeply read in Enlightenment philosophy and history, a skilled drafter of political documents. He was also, by contemporary account, a poor public speaker who rarely contributed to floor debates, but whose written work had a quality that his contemporaries recognized immediately as extraordinary. The reputation had preceded him to Philadelphia, and it was partly on the basis of that reputation that he was assigned to the committee that would draft the Declaration of Independence. But all of that was still more than a year away. In the early summer of 1775, the Congress's immediate problem was the army. The militia surrounding Boston was not an army in any disciplined sense. It was a collection of colonial volunteers who had come because the British regulars were threatening their communities and who would go home when they felt the immediate threat was managed, or when the harvest needed attention, whichever came first. Converting this spontaneous gathering into a continental army capable of sustained military operations over the months and years that would clearly be required was the most urgent practical challenge before the Congress, and the choice of who would command it was the most important single decision they would make in the summer of 1775. George Washington of Virginia was the choice, and it was the right choice. though the reasons it was the right choice were not all immediately apparent. He was the most experienced military man in the Congress. His service in the French and Indian War had given him battlefield experience that few of the delegates could match. He was from Virginia, the largest and most populous colony, whose commitment to the common cause was essential, and whose delegation's support of a New England commander would have been politically complicated. He was physically impressive in a way that the 18th century understood as a genuine qualification for command. Tall, powerfully built, with the bearing and the presence that men looked for in a leader when battles were fought by men standing in lines of fire. And he was a man whose character, as subsequent years would amply demonstrate, combined the specific virtues that the situation required: the patience to endure repeated setbacks without losing strategic perspective, the organisational ability to construct a functioning army out of inadequate materials, the political intelligence to manage the civilian authorities that commanded him without allowing their interference to destroy his operational effectiveness, and a personal dignity and integrity that inspired the kind of loyalty that the prolonged, difficult, often desperate war would need. Washington accepted the command on June 15, 1775, in a speech that was characteristically modest and characteristically precise. He expressed doubt that his qualifications were adequate to the task, declined any salary beyond his expenses, and asked the Congress to remember that he had declared with all sincerity that he did not think himself equal to the command. It was a performance of Republican virtue, the disinterested citizen soldier accepting duty without appetite for personal glory. That was also genuinely accurate as a self-assessment. Washington was not a military genius of the order of Marlborough or Frederick the Great. He lost more battles than he won. What he was something more valuable to the revolution than tactical brilliance. A commander who understood that his primary objective was to keep an army in existence long enough for political circumstances to change, and who pursued that objective with a stubbornness and a moral steadiness that the 8 years of the war would test in every possible dimension. The Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, actually fought on the adjacent Breed's Hill, a geographical correction that has never displaced the more evocative name from the historical record, was the first major engagement of the Revolutionary War, and produced results that both sides found instructive in different ways. The colonial militia had occupied the hill overlooking Boston Harbour during the night of June 16th, and the British decision to dislodge them by direct assault up the slope, when a flanking movement might have surrounded them, was a choice that General Gage made partly for tactical reasons, and partly because the American leadership believed that colonial militia would not stand against the disciplined fire of British regulars advancing in formation. They stood. The colonial defenders instructed by their commanders not to fire until they could see the whites of the eyes of the advancing British, a practical instruction about volley fire discipline at range rather than the dramatic romantic command it became in the telling, waited until the British were within effective range, and then delivered volleys that stopped 2 successive British assaults with severe casualties. The British line broke twice, reformed, and came up the hill a 3rd time, and this time the colonial defenders ran out of ammunition before the British reached the top and had to withdraw. The British took the hill, but at a cost of approximately 226 dead and 828 wounded, over 40% of the attacking force, including many of the army's most experienced officers, losses that Gage described in terms that suggested he understood the battle had demonstrated something about the war that the British government had not adequately appreciated. What it demonstrated was that American militia, given adequate time to prepare defensive positions, adequate leadership and adequate ammunition, could inflict casualties on British regulars at a rate that the British Empire, for all its wealth and military tradition, could not indefinitely sustain. It was not a lesson that translated immediately into American battlefield success. The Continental Army would lose many more engagements than it won over the next 7 years, but it was a lesson about the fundamental strategic situation that shaped Washington's entire conduct of the war. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in early July 1775 to take command of the besieging force, and found a situation considerably worse than he had expected, and a letter of complaint considerably longer than the Congress had anticipated. The army had inadequate powder, a critical deficiency in an era when black powder was the only propellant available. It had inadequate artillery, inadequate muskets, and inadequate discipline. It was organised in a way that reflected the independent military traditions of the separate colonies, rather than any unified command structure. The officers had been chosen partly on political grounds by the colonial governments that had commissioned them, rather than on military merit. It was, Washington wrote privately, a situation that no person living knows of outside my own breast. What Washington needed, and what arrived in the early months of 1776 in a manner he had not expected, was artillery. Henry Knox, a 25-year-old Boston bookseller with no military experience beyond his reading, but with extraordinary organizational energy and practical intelligence, volunteered to go to Fort Ticonderoga, the former French fortress on Lake Champlain that an American force under Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys had seized in May 1775, and bring back the cannon that the fort contained. The cannon were there. The problem was getting them to Boston. 60 tons of artillery across 300 miles of winter wilderness over the Berkshire Hills in the depths of the Massachusetts winter. Knox managed it, using sleds and oxen and extraordinary persistence, arriving in Cambridge in January 1776 with 59 cannon of various sizes, enough to transform the military situation around Boston. Washington moved the artillery to Dorchester Heights, the commanding ground south of Boston that overlooked both the city and the harbour, on the night of March 4th, 1776. The speed and silence with which the operation was conducted, building fortifications on Dorchester Heights overnight in a way that put operational cannon in place before the British could respond, genuinely shocked the British Commander General Howe, who had replaced Gage the previous year and left him with a choice between an assault on the heights that the memory of Bunker Hill made uninviting and a withdrawal from Boston that he did not want to make. He made the withdrawal on March 17th, 1776, St. Patrick's Day, a date that has a particular resonance in Boston given what the city's later demographic history would make of it. The British evacuated Boston, loading 11,000 soldiers and more than 1,000 loyalist civilians onto ships and sailing for Halifax. Washington entered the city he had besieged without a pitched battle, having used the science of artillery placement and the organizational genius of an amateur to accomplish what the 12 months of encirclement had not. The movement toward independence that would produce the Declaration in July 1776 had been building for a year, but it had not been universally embraced within the Congress or within the colonial population. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia represented not a unified colonial public opinion, but a spectrum of views that ranged from the ardent independence position of the Massachusetts delegation and the more radical Virginians to the cautious constitutionalism of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, whose commercial and social connections to Britain were stronger, and whose populations contained significant numbers of loyalists, people who opposed parliamentary taxation and coercive acts, but who could not bring themselves to endorse a complete break with the empire. The specific catalyst for the decisive shift in public opinion toward independence was a small pamphlet published on January 10, 1776, by a recently arrived English immigrant named Thomas Paine. Common Sense was unlike any political document the colonies had seen before, not the careful, lawyer-like constitutional argument of a John Adams or a John Dickinson, but a passionate, accessible, furious denunciation of monarchy itself, of the very concept of hereditary rule, and of the specific claim that any people calling themselves free could remain subjects of a king. Paine wrote in a style deliberately designed for the broadest possible audience, short sentences, concrete imagery, biblical cadences that would resonate with a colonial population that read the Bible more than it read anything else. And he made the case for independence not as a constitutional adjustment, but as a moral necessity, a demand of human nature and human dignity that the specific grievances against George III had simply made impossible to ignore any longer. The pamphlet sold approximately 500,000 copies in a colonial population of about 2.5 million, a ratio that makes it per capita the best-selling title in American publishing history. It was read aloud in taverns and at militia musters and in farmhouses across the colonies. Washington had it read to his troops. It shifted the terms of the political debate with a speed that the more measured constitutional arguments of the preceding decade had not achieved, because it reframed the question, not whether Parliament had exceeded its constitutional authority, which was an argument that required legal training to fully follow, but whether any human being had the right to rule another by birth, which was an argument that required only the willingness to take seriously the proposition that all men were created equal. The Congress moved toward independence through the spring of 1776 with a combination of political negotiation and external pressure that made the final vote feel, to some of the men who cast it, both inevitable and terrifying. The external pressure came from the military situation. By June 1776, British forces were gathering for a campaign to retake New York, and the middle colonies that made it clear the war was not going to be a brief punitive demonstration, but a sustained conflict whose outcome was genuinely uncertain. The political negotiations centred on the middle colony delegations, whose instructions from their provincial assemblies did not yet authorise independence. Delegates who were personally prepared to vote for independence, but who were not authorised to do so by the governments they represented, and who needed those authorisations to arrive before the vote could be unanimous, or as close to unanimous as the Congress could manage. The Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 on June 11, 1776, to prepare a Declaration of Independence in anticipation of the vote it expected to hold in early July. The committee was Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. The decision to give Jefferson the primary drafting responsibility was partly a recognition of his literary gifts, partly a calculation by Adams that a Virginian author would make the document more acceptable to the southern colonies, and partly the simple fact that Adams was too busy with committee work to undertake a sustained drafting effort himself. Adams' later account of the conversation in which Jefferson was assigned the drafting is one of the more endearing exchanges in the Revolutionary record, Jefferson protesting that Adams should write it, Adams insisting that Jefferson do it, Jefferson asking why, Adams giving reasons, including that Jefferson could write 10 times better than Adams could, a claim that Jefferson did not dispute. The intellectual tradition that Jefferson was drawing on when he wrote the Declaration was not invented for the occasion. It was the product of a century of political philosophy, primarily British and Scottish in origin, filtered through the specific reading culture of the colonial educated class. That the political crisis of the preceding decade had made suddenly and urgently relevant to colonial political actors who had been reading it for decades as political philosophy and were now discovering that they needed it as political programme. John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, published in 1689 in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, was the foundational text of the natural rights tradition that the Declaration's famous second paragraph expressed. Locke had argued that individuals in a state of nature possessed natural rights to life, liberty and property that were prior to and independent of any political authority, and that legitimate government was constituted by the consent of those governed, who retained the right to withdraw that consent and dissolve the government if it failed to protect the natural rights it was instituted to secure. The influence of this argument on the Declaration is so direct that Jefferson sometimes quoted Locke's specific phrases, substituting the pursuit of happiness for Locke's property in the famous triad. a substitution whose significance political philosophers have been discussing ever since, suggesting that Jefferson was drawing on the Scottish Enlightenment's concept of moral sentiment and human flourishing, as well as on Locke's property rights framework. The Scottish Enlightenment, centred in Edinburgh and Glasgow in the mid-18th century, provided another strand of the intellectual tradition that shaped the Declaration and the broader revolutionary ideology. Adam Smith, David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, and their colleagues had developed a philosophical tradition that combined a rigorous empiricism about human nature and social organization with a moral philosophy grounded in human sociability and the natural moral sense. The idea that human beings had an innate capacity for moral judgment that was the foundation of ethical life and political order. The colonial educated class had absorbed the Scottish tradition alongside the Lockean natural rights tradition, and the specific combination of the two, natural rights from Locke, moral sense from Hutcheson, historical analysis from Hume, economic theory from Smith, provided the intellectual toolkit with which the revolutionary leaders worked. The colonial reading culture that had absorbed this tradition was itself remarkable for its breadth and its seriousness. Colonial literacy rates, particularly in New England, were among the highest in the world in the 18th century, and the print culture of the colonies, the newspapers, the pamphlets, the political essays that circulated in coffee houses and taverns, and across the networks of correspondence that connected the colonial elites to each other and to British and European intellectual life, was the medium through which the revolution was prepared. The political argument of the 1760s and 1770s was conducted to a significant degree in print, in the pamphlets and newspaper essays that the colonial printers produced in extraordinary quantities, and that reached audiences across class lines in ways that the more formal genres of political writing did not. The specific colonial political tradition that these influences fed into had also been shaped by a century of practical experience in self-governance that gave the colonial constitutional argument a grounding in concrete practice that purely philosophical argument lacked. The colonial assemblies had been legislating, taxing, spending and governing since the early 17th century, and the men who served in them had developed political skills and constitutional knowledge that they brought to the Continental Congress with the confidence of experienced practitioners rather than the hesitancy of theoretical beginners. James Madison, who would write the Constitution 11 years after the Declaration, had been a member of the Virginia legislature and a student of constitutional theory simultaneously, and the specific design of the American governmental system reflected this combination of theoretical sophistication and practical experience. Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence in 17 days, working in his rented rooms on the second floor of a brick house at the corner of 7th and Market Streets in Philadelphia. He was 33 years old. He worked from memory and from 2 small books he had brought to Philadelphia: his own copy of George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, adopted by the Virginia Convention just weeks before, and a collection of John Locke's political writings. He was drawing on a tradition of Enlightenment political philosophy that ran from Locke through the Scottish moral philosophers, from the English constitutional tradition through the natural rights theory that had been the foundation of colonial political argument for a decade. He was not inventing new ideas. He was, as he said afterward, not trying to find out new principles or new arguments, never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. What he produced was a document of extraordinary rhetorical architecture. The famous second paragraph: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," is so thoroughly embedded in the American political tradition that it is almost impossible for Americans to read it with fresh eyes. to hear it as it was heard by the people who first encountered it in the summer of 1776. It was not, to those readers, a statement of established principles. It was a radical assertion, a philosophical claim about the foundation of legitimate political authority that was in direct contradiction to the political systems of most of the world, including significant parts of the world that the men signing the document themselves governed. The proposition that all men are created equal was not the description of a social reality. It was a standard by which social reality was to be judged and found wanting, and its inclusion in the founding document of a new republic was an act of either extraordinary courage or extraordinary hypocrisy, depending on whether you considered the men who wrote it capable of eventually living up to it. The Declaration of Independence as adopted on July 4th, 1776 was not exactly the document Jefferson had drafted. The Congress worked through his draft over several days, making approximately 80 changes to the text and deleting roughly a quarter of the original content. Most of the changes were improvements, or at least defensible editorial decisions. The most significant deletion was an entire passage in which Jefferson had blamed the slave trade directly on George III, a passage that was politically unsustainable given the specific interests of the South Carolina and Georgia delegations whose colonies depended on the slave trade, and that was also somewhat dishonest as an argument, since the slave trade had been practiced willingly by the colonists themselves for generations. Jefferson was deeply unhappy about the deletions, particularly this one, and spent years afterward referring to the Congress's changes as mutilations. He was right that the Congress cut some of his best prose. He was not right that the slave trade passage was among his most defensible arguments. The specific physical circumstances of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 are worth dwelling on, because they are humanizing in the most literal sense. They remind us that the men who created these documents were doing so in bodies, in a specific place, in specific weather, under specific pressures that the subsequent ceremonies of the national mythology have smoothed into something more heroic and less human than what actually happened. Philadelphia in July was, by all contemporary accounts, miserably hot. The Pennsylvania State House, which housed the Congress on its second floor in a chamber that was elegant by colonial standards and a thermal trap by any standard, had windows that could be opened for ventilation and that could not be opened without admitting the flies from the nearby stables that were the colonial equivalent of a parking lot. Contemporary accounts describe the delegates swatting flies throughout the proceedings and debating in an atmosphere of combined heat and insect assault that was not conducive to the elevated rhetorical exchanges that the subsequent tradition preferred to imagine. The delegates were exhausted. They had been in session since May, and many of them had been in Philadelphia for months, away from their farms and their businesses and their families, in a city that was more expensive than any of them had anticipated, and that the summer heat was making genuinely unpleasant. The chamber itself was a room that most modern visitors would recognize as gracious rather than grand. The panelled walls, the tall windows, the Windsor chairs arranged around tables covered in green baize, the presiding officer's chair at the front with its carved wooden sunburst, whose significance Franklin would famously comment on after the Constitutional Convention. It was a room designed for legislative business, for the practical back and forth of amendment and debate and vote, rather than for ceremony, and the proceedings of early July 1776 had more of the quality of a working, legislative session than of a historic monument in the making. The debate over the Declaration text, the line-by-line editing that the Congress conducted over July 2nd, 3rd and 4th, was as contentious and as politically loaded as any legislative debate, and Jefferson sat through the revision of his text with a combination of authorial distress and political professionalism that Adams, sitting next to him, observed with sympathy and occasional amusement. Jefferson had written the Declaration as a single unified argument, and the Congress's editorial interventions, removing whole passages, modifying specific phrases, tightening some arguments and softening others, disrupted the architectural coherence of the document in ways that Jefferson found genuinely painful, though the Congress's instincts were not always wrong. The deletion of the slave trade passage was perhaps the clearest example of political calculation overriding philosophical consistency, but several of the other changes strengthened rather than weakened the text by eliminating passages where Jefferson's rhetorical enthusiasm had outrun his logical precision. The vote on independence was taken on July 2nd, 1776, not July 4th, which was the date the Declaration was formally adopted after the final text had been agreed upon. John Adams, writing to his wife Abigail the day after the vote, predicted that July 2nd would be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, which is one of the more endearing cases of the political prophet being right about the event and wrong about the date. The vote was 12 colonies in favour, 0 opposed, with New York abstaining because its delegation had not yet received authorization from the New York Provincial Congress. The authorization arrived shortly afterward, making the final vote unanimous. The formal signing of the parchment copy of the Declaration that most people picture when they think of the event was not a ceremony that occurred on July 4th, 1776. Most of the delegates signed on August 2nd, 1776, when a parchment copy had been prepared, and some signed later. The last signature was added in November. The image of 56 men gathered around a table in Philadelphia on July 4th and solemnly signing a document is largely a mythological construction, though there was a gathering on July 4th to adopt the text, and there were genuine solemnity and genuine risk involved for everyone who participated. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, a large jovial man who was a great-great-great-grandfather of 2 future presidents, reportedly joked to the thin and nervous Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts as they approached the signing table that he had an advantage over Gerry. "With my large body I will be finished quickly, but you will be hanging half an hour after I'm dead." It was a gallows joke in the most literal possible sense. The men signing the Declaration were committing treason against the Crown. If the revolution failed, they would hang. The war that the Declaration both reflected and accelerated was a war of 8 years' duration, fought across an enormous geographic range from Quebec in the north to the Carolinas in the south, from the Atlantic coast to the Ohio Valley, and eventually extending to naval engagements in the Caribbean and off the coasts of Europe. It was a war that the Americans could not win quickly, and the British could not afford to lose slowly, and the strategic dynamic that this created, British operational success on the battlefield combined with American strategic persistence in keeping an army in existence, shaped the conflict's entire arc from Bunker Hill to Yorktown. Washington's strategic predicament in the summer of 1776 was severe. The British force that arrived off New York in June and July, initially approximately 30,000 soldiers, the largest British military force ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere, under the command of General William Howe, with naval support from his brother Admiral Richard Howe, was a professional military establishment of the first order facing a continental army that was still finding its organizational identity. The New York campaign that followed was, from a purely military standpoint, a disaster for Washington. The Battle of Long Island in late August drove the Continental Army off Brooklyn Heights with severe casualties. The army was saved from capture only by a night evacuation across the East River in small boats that was itself a considerable logistical achievement, and a series of subsequent engagements at Kips Bay, at Harlem Heights, at White Plains, and finally the fall of Fort Washington on Manhattan in November, which cost more than 2,800 American prisoners, drove Washington's army progressively across New Jersey toward the Delaware River, with the British in pursuit and the Continental Army melting away as enlistments expired and men went home. By December 1776, Washington's effective force had been reduced to approximately 3,000 men, disease-ridden, equipment depleted, desperately short of everything, facing a winter without adequate shelter, and the imminent expiration of most of the remaining enlistments on January 1st, 1777. Thomas Paine, who had enlisted as a soldier and was marching with the army, wrote the first of the American Crisis pamphlets at this moment. These are the times that try men's souls, and Washington had the words read to his troops, partly because they were true, and partly because truth presented with sufficient rhetorical force can be sustaining in ways that the truth presented baldly cannot. It was in this desperate context that Washington planned and executed the operation that saved the Revolution, not by winning the war, but by winning enough to change the political calculation that the British and the American populations were each making about whether to continue. The crossing of the Delaware on the night of December 25th to 26th, 1776, is one of the most famous events in American military history, and its fame is justified. Washington moved approximately 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River in a blizzard on the night of Christmas, when the Hessian garrison at Trenton was assumed to be celebrating the holiday and not anticipating attack. The assumption was correct. The Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British government from several German princes, the most significant military subcontracting arrangement of the 18th century, were caught genuinely off guard, their commander Johannes Rall killed in the fighting that the surprise attack produced, and approximately 900 Hessian soldiers captured at a cost of no Americans killed in action, with 2 dying of exposure during the crossing. The victory at Trenton was followed by the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, where Washington drove off a British force with a flanking movement that his subordinates admired for its tactical intelligence, and then by a withdrawal into winter quarters at Morristown in New Jersey. The military significance of Trenton and Princeton was limited. A few hundred prisoners and a modest improvement in the tactical situation around New Jersey. The political significance was enormous. The revolution had been, for the preceding 3 months, visibly failing. The declaration had been signed, the British had taken New York, the army was disintegrating, and the public support for the independence cause was collapsing in New Jersey and Pennsylvania under the weight of British military occupation and the practical reality that supporting the colonial cause had become very dangerous. The victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that the Continental Army could still fight, that Washington was still capable of offensive action, and that the winter campaign was not over. They bought time. They kept the revolution alive through the winter into the spring of 1777, and the campaign that would change everything. The winter that fell between the campaigns of 1777 and 1778 was the lowest point of the Revolutionary War for the Continental Army, and the story of Valley Forge is worth telling in its specific physical detail rather than in the soft focus reverence that the mythology has given it, because the specific detail is more revealing about what the revolution actually cost than the mythology allows. Washington moved his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, approximately 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, in December 1777. The location was chosen for defensive reasons. High ground that was defensible against a British sortie from Philadelphia, which Howe's army had captured in September, and for logistical reasons. Proximity to the agricultural hinterland of Pennsylvania that was supposed to supply the army through the winter. Both calculations proved optimistic. The high ground of Valley Forge provided the defensive position, but also the exposure to the winter winds that made the construction of adequate shelter the first and most urgent priority. The Pennsylvania hinterland was less forthcoming with supplies than the logistical planners had assumed, partly because the local farmers preferred to sell to the British in Philadelphia, who paid in coin rather than the continental currency that was already losing its value with alarming speed. The army that went into Valley Forge consisted of approximately 11,000 men. The huts they built, log cabins constructed to Washington's specific dimensional specifications, 12 by 16 feet, housing 12 men each, built by men who were already weakened by the New Jersey and Pennsylvania campaigns, and who were working through December cold with inadequate clothing and inadequate food, provided shelter from the worst of the weather, but not from disease. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, and the various camp fevers that ran through any 18th century army in winter quarters killed approximately 2,500 men at Valley Forge, not in battle, but in the huts, of diseases that adequate food and adequate clothing and adequate sanitation would have prevented. Men went barefoot in the snow because there were no shoes. Horses died in their dozens as fodder ran out. Their carcasses left where they fell because there was neither the strength nor the tools to move them. Whole units were reported unfit for duty because their men had no shoes or adequate clothing to venture out of their huts. Washington's correspondence from Valley Forge is the most despairing of his career, and that is worth pausing on because Washington was not a man given to despair. His letters to the Congress and to the various state governments described the Army's condition with a bluntness that the diplomatic formulations of his normal correspondence give way to. Men are perishing in significant numbers. The supply system has failed. Without immediate action to provide food, clothing, and pay, the Army will dissolve. The Congress heard him and responded with the combination of sympathy and institutional helplessness that characterized its dealings with the Army's supply problems throughout the war. The structural weakness of the Articles of Confederation, which gave the Congress no power to tax and therefore no reliable revenue, made the supply system dependent on the voluntary cooperation of the states that the war's urgency repeatedly failed to secure. What saved the Army at Valley Forge was not primarily the heroism of the soldiers, though there was genuine heroism in simply surviving. It was the arrival in February 1778 of Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who had served on Frederick the Great's staff, who spoke no English, who had somewhat misrepresented his military rank and connections in his letters of introduction, but whose actual military expertise was entirely genuine, who proceeded through interpreters and through the force of a personality that the soldiers found simultaneously intimidating and comic, to drill the Continental Army in the Prussian manual of arms and the Prussian system of tactical manoeuvre. The drilling at Valley Forge transformed the Continental Army from an armed mass into a professional military force, one that, in the battles of the following year's campaign, would stand its ground against British regulars in ways that the earlier campaigns had demonstrated it could not reliably do. The campaign of 1777 was the critical year of the Revolutionary War, and its pivotal moment was the Battle of Saratoga, or more precisely the series of engagements in the woods and fields north of Albany in September and October of 1777 that ended with the surrender of an entire British army and changed the geopolitical context of the war in ways that Washington and the Continental Congress had been trying to achieve for 2 years. The British strategy for 1777 was a plan to isolate New England, which they correctly identified as the heart of the revolutionary movement, by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley and connecting with the northern forces coming down from Canada, cutting New England off from the middle and southern colonies and, they hoped, strangling the rebellion's political and military infrastructure. The plan required coordination between 3 separate forces: General John Burgoyne coming south from Canada along the Champlain-Hudson corridor, a smaller force under Colonel Barry St. Leger coming east through the Mohawk Valley from Oswego, and Howe's main army moving north from New York to meet Burgoyne on the Hudson. What actually happened was that Howe, whose communications with London were operating across an Atlantic Ocean that messages took 6 weeks to cross, decided to take his army south to attack Philadelphia instead of north to support Burgoyne, a decision whose strategic logic was debated at the time and has been debated by historians ever since. What is unambiguous is its consequence. Burgoyne was left to manage the northern campaign without the southern support the plan had called for. Burgoyne's campaign south from Canada has a quality of tragic inevitability about it that the historical record captures in detail unusual for the 18th century. He was a theatrical figure, playwright, socialite, member of parliament, a man whose nickname Gentleman Johnny reflected both his social manner and his unusual concern for the welfare of his troops, who was managing a strategic situation that was already problematic before he began and that deteriorated progressively as he moved south. His supply lines stretched back to Canada grew longer and more vulnerable. A foraging expedition to collect horses and supplies was destroyed at the Battle of Bennington in August by New Hampshire and Vermont militia under John Stark, who told his men before the battle that there are the redcoats and they are ours, or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight, another of the war's memorable phrases and one that was at least approximately accurate to the occasion. Street. Ledger's Mohawk Valley force was turned back at the siege of Fort Stanwix by a combination of American resistance and the defection of his Native American allies after a devastating ambush at the Battle of Oriskany. And ahead of Burgoyne, the American forces under General Horatio Gates were concentrating at Bemis Heights near Saratoga, in a position that the brilliant tactician Benedict Arnold and the fortification engineer Thaddeus Kosciuszko had helped select and prepare. The two battles at Saratoga, Freeman's Farm on September the 19th and Bemis Heights on October 7th, were among the most intense engagements of the entire war. The American forces under Gates's nominal command, but with Arnold providing the aggressive tactical initiative that Gates's more cautious temperament inclined him to withhold, attacked the British lines with a fury that the British regulars, who had expected provincial militia and gotten determined continental soldiers, found genuinely surprising. Arnold, who had been relieved of his command by Gates in one of the petty personality conflicts that characterized much of the Continental Army's internal politics, returned to the battlefield during the second engagement without authorization, riding along the American lines under heavy fire in the kind of conspicuous personal leadership that simultaneously inspired men and created enormous personal risk. He was severely wounded in the leg. The British position was broken. Burgoyne, his flanks turned and his retreat cut off by an American force that had grown to nearly 20,000 men surrounding his approximately 6,000, had no choice. On October 17th, 1777, General John Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to General Horatio Gates. It was the first time in the history of the British Army that an entire army had surrendered in the field. The impact of Saratoga was immediate, decisive, and global. In France, which had been watching the American war with intense interest and providing covert support, money, arms, supplies, through the fictitious merchant company Rodriguez Hortalier Etier that the playwright and entrepreneur Caron de Beaumarchais had organized at the French Foreign Ministry's direction, the news of Saratoga removed the last significant obstacle to open alliance. The French had been willing to support the Americans covertly, as long as the Americans showed they could fight. Saratoga showed they could not only fight but win at the strategic level, and the French government under Louis XVI and his foreign minister Vergennes signed the Treaty of Alliance with the United States on February 6, 1778. France was now openly at war with Britain, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a global conflict that would be fought in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, and eventually off the coasts of Britain itself. The French alliance was not merely the formal diplomatic achievement of the Treaty of February 1778. It was a relationship that shaped the military operations of the war from Saratoga onward, in ways that went far beyond the formal provisions of the treaty, and the specific French contributions to American independence deserve more than the passing mention they typically receive in the American national memory. The Marquis de Lafayette was the most famous individual expression of French support, and his fame has some justification beyond the romanticism that subsequent generations attached to the young nobleman who resigned his commission in the French army, bought his own ship, defied the explicit orders of Louis XVI, sailed to America at 20 years old, and offered his services to the Continental Army without pay. Lafayette was a capable commander and a more important political symbol. His presence with Washington's army and his letters home to France describing the American cause in terms that the French reading public found compelling were part of the sustained campaign to build French public support for intervention that Franklin was conducting from his base in Passy. When Lafayette returned to France in early 1779, decorated with the wounds he had taken in the American service and full of the specific first-hand knowledge that made him a credible advocate, the public enthusiasm he generated was a genuine political factor in the French government's decision to commit more fully to the alliance. The financial contribution of France to the American Revolution was perhaps the most critical of all, though it is also the least romanticized. By the end of the war, France had provided approximately 1.3 billion livres to the American cause, in direct subsidies, in loans, in the cost of the French military forces that served in America and in the Caribbean. This was an enormous sum for the French treasury, which was already strained by the accumulated wars of the preceding century, and the financial burden of the American alliance was one of the direct causes of the French fiscal crisis of the 1780s that led to the calling of the Estates General and the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. The American Revolution was, in a financial sense, partially purchased with the money that destroyed the French monarchy, an irony whose full dimensions only became clear in retrospect. The French army that arrived in America with Rochambeau in July 1780, approximately 5,500 professional soldiers, well equipped and well supplied by the standards that the Continental Army found almost overwhelming, transformed American military capacity in ways that went beyond numbers. The French siege artillery that reduced the British fortifications at Yorktown was operated by French gunners with a technical expertise that the Continental Army could not match. The French engineers, particularly Rochambeau's chief engineer, who had been trained in the Vauban siege tradition that was the most sophisticated in the world, planned and supervised the approach trenches and battery positions that made the Yorktown siege a textbook operation, rather than an improvised assault. The combination of American determination and French military professionalism produced at Yorktown the specific operational excellence that the campaign required. Spain entered the war on France's side in June 1779, followed by the Netherlands in 1780. Britain found itself fighting not a colonial rebellion, but a coalition of major European powers, without a significant continental ally of its own, and with the specific strategic vulnerability that Pitt the Elder had always warned against. A Britain that had to garrison the Caribbean, defend Gibraltar, protect its Indian possessions, maintain a North Sea fleet against the Dutch, and fight in North America simultaneously, was a Britain stretched beyond what even its extraordinary commercial and maritime resources could sustain indefinitely. The war in the South that occupied British strategy from 1778 onward was a response to the stalemate in the North and reflected a British strategic assessment, the Southern strategy, that the Southern colonies contained a substantial loyalist population that would rise to support a British force that appeared to be winning, and that, once secured, would provide the base for rolling up the rebellion from the South. The assessment was not entirely wrong. There were substantial loyalist communities in the Carolinas and Georgia, and the British initially found it possible to raise loyalist military units that supplemented the regular forces. What the Southern strategy underestimated was the intensity of the Civil War dimension of the Southern conflict, the brutal personalised violence between patriots and loyalists that made the Southern theatre the most savage of the entire Revolutionary War, and the effectiveness of the guerrilla resistance that commanders like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens organised against British control of the countryside. The British conquered Charleston in May 1780 in the worst American military defeat of the entire war. General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered approximately 5,400 soldiers, the largest American capitulation until the Civil War. They overran Georgia and South Carolina through the spring and summer of 1780, and at the Battle of Camden in August, General Charles Cornwallis drove the American force under Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, from the field in a defeat so complete that Gates himself fled the battlefield on horseback and didn't stop until he was 60 miles away, a performance that ended his military career in a different kind of distinction than Saratoga had provided. But the Southern strategy was coming apart even as these victories were being won. The massacre of surrendered American soldiers at the Waxhaws by British cavalry under Colonel Banastre Tarleton, whose refusal to accept surrender that men were genuinely trying to offer, produced the battle cry Tarleton's Quarter, meaning no mercy, enraged the Southern population in ways that turned neutral or ambivalent communities toward active resistance. The Battle of King's Mountain in October 1780, where an over-mountain militia force killed or captured an entire loyalist force and killed the British officer commanding it in the fighting, demonstrated the limits of British control once you moved off the main roads and into the back country. And the appointment of Nathaniel Greene to command the Continental forces in the south in December 1780 brought a strategist of genuine ability to the theatre who understood from the beginning what the situation required. Greene's Southern campaign is one of the most intelligent exercises in strategic warfare in American military history. He did not try to fight Cornwallis in the pitched battles where the British regulars had the advantage. He manoeuvred, divided his forces when it served him, and concentrated when it was necessary. Used Daniel Morgan's riflemen in the flying column tactics that the terrain and the available forces made optimal. The Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, where Morgan destroyed Tarleton's cavalry force with a double envelopment that military historians have compared to Hannibal's encirclement at Cannae, broke the offensive capacity of Cornwallis's army in South Carolina. Then began the race to the Dan, a strategic retreat to the Dan River in Virginia that was simultaneously a defeat and a strategic masterstroke, as Greene led Cornwallis northward into unfamiliar territory, where British supply lines stretched to the breaking point while the American forces that Greene had sent south resumed the liberation of the Carolinas behind Cornwallis's back. Cornwallis pursued Greene into North Carolina and Virginia, fighting the grinding engagement at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, where he technically won the field, but at such cost, 30% casualties among his force, that the victory was, in the famous phrase of Horace Walpole in London, another such victory and he would have no army left. He turned north into Virginia, where Benedict Arnold, who had committed his treason, passed West Point's plans to the British and escaped to British lines in September 1780, earning the specific contempt of both sides that the history of his defection has preserved with remarkable precision, was conducting raids on the Virginia coast. Cornwallis continued north, eventually taking his army into Yorktown on the York River, from which a British naval resupply could maintain him while he reorganised. The Yorktown campaign of September and October 1781 was the most complex operation of the entire Revolutionary War, requiring the coordination of American and French forces on land with French naval forces at sea in ways that every previous Franco-American joint operation had failed to achieve. The key was the Chesapeake. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse had sailed from the Caribbean with 28 ships of the line and approximately 3,000 additional French soldiers, arriving off the Virginia Capes at the end of August. The British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves met de Grasse on September 5th in the Battle of the Chesapeake, one of the most consequential naval battles in the history of either the British or American nations. And after several hours of inconclusive fighting in which the French had the advantage of position and numbers, Graves withdrew to New York. Cornwallis was trapped. His seaborne line of supply and reinforcement and potential evacuation had been cut. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined force of approximately 16,000 men from the Hudson Valley to Virginia in a rapid and deceptive movement that left Sir Henry Clinton in New York uncertain of their destination until they were already closing in on Yorktown. The siege that followed was a formal 18th century siege conducted by European standards. Trenches dug in parallel lines, artillery batteries established with engineering precision, redoubts stormed in the night assaults of October 14th, in which Alexander Hamilton commanded one of the American assaulting columns, with the aggressive energy that would distinguish his entire public career. Cornwallis, his position untenable, his request for relief going unanswered, requested a cessation of hostilities on October 17, 1781, the 4th anniversary of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, and the formal surrender took place on October 19th. The British Army marched out to a surrender field where the French Army stood on one side and the Continental Army on the other, and the band played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down. Cornwallis himself claimed illness and sent a subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to present his sword. O'Hara, following instructions, first approached Rochambeau to surrender to the senior French officer. Rochambeau deflected him to Washington. Washington, unwilling to receive the sword from a subordinate when Cornwallis had not come himself, deflected him to his own deputy, General Benjamin Lincoln. The exchange of the sword was a symbolic negotiation of the pride of great powers, conducted with a formality that the occasion demanded, and that the men participating in it understood as the visible expression of political realities that the fighting had settled. Before we arrive at the peace and the constitutional settlement, the full story of the revolution requires attending to several groups whose participation in it the traditional narrative has consistently underrepresented. The women who sustained the revolution did so across every dimension of the war effort, without receiving the recognition that the official history awarded to the men whose military and political roles were more visible. The most immediate contribution was the most essential: the management of farms and businesses and households whose male members were absent for months or years at a time. In a wartime economy of shortages and inflation and currency instability that made ordinary household management genuinely difficult, and the management of a farm or a small business under those conditions a considerable achievement. The women who spun and wove the cloth that clothed the Continental Army, the spinning bee and the weaving circle were explicitly organized as patriotic activities in the popular culture of the Revolution, were contributing to the war effort in practical terms as direct as those of the men who carried muskets. Some women contributed more directly still. The camp followers who accompanied the Continental Army, wives and daughters of soldiers who cooked, laundered, nursed the wounded, and in some cases fought, were a recognized and structured part of the Army's operational system that Washington's orders acknowledged rather than deplored. Molly Pitcher, the composite figure who may represent Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, and possibly other women as well, became the legendary representative of the women who loaded and fired cannon when their husbands fell at battle, a legend that has some specific factual foundation in the records of women who served at the guns at Monmouth. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts disguised herself as a man, enlisted under the name Robert Shirtleff, and served for approximately 17 months in combat before her sex was discovered, serving, by the record, with genuine competence and genuine courage. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband John as he was helping draft the law code of the new nation, asked him to remember the ladies and not to put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands, a request whose political seriousness John Adams deflected with what has seemed to subsequent generations an unfortunate levity. The black Americans who fought in the Revolutionary War on both sides represent one of the most complex and most consequential threads of the entire conflict. Approximately 5,000 black soldiers served in the Continental Army, some of them free men who enlisted for the standard patriot reasons, and some of them enslaved men who had been promised freedom in exchange for military service. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which recruited heavily from enslaved and free black men in 1778, after Rhode Island's white manpower was exhausted, became one of the most effective units in the Continental Army, and proved its quality repeatedly in the engagements of 1778 and 1781 in ways that the Army's history records, but that the national mythology has been slow to incorporate. Lord Dunmore's proclamation of November 1775 issued by the British governor of Virginia, who had fled to a Royal Navy ship in the Chesapeake, offered freedom to the enslaved people of rebel colonists who escaped to British lines and were able to bear arms. The proclamation was the most radical act on behalf of black freedom that any governmental authority had yet undertaken in British North America, and it was deeply effective as a military and political instrument. Approximately 800 enslaved people escaped to the British within weeks of its issuance, and the total number who escaped to British lines during the war is estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000, a range whose imprecision reflects the difficulty of documenting movements that were made in secret, and that the slaveholding society that produced the records had strong reasons to undercount. The British Ethiopians Regiment, formerly enslaved people fighting in a uniformed unit under British command, fought at the Battle of Savannah and at the Siege of Charleston, and in other southern engagements with an intensity that the specific personal stakes involved explain clearly enough. The tragedy of the black military contribution to the revolution, on both sides, was that neither outcome delivered the freedom that the war's rhetoric promised. The 5,000 black soldiers who fought for American independence found themselves living in a republic that had protected slavery in its constitution. The approximately 3,000 black loyalists who were evacuated with the British to Nova Scotia at the war's end found themselves deposited in a cold and inhospitable colony with minimal assistance and persistent discrimination, before a portion of them eventually made their way to Sierra Leone in the first back-to-Africa migration in the history of the Atlantic world. The revolution that proclaimed liberty as an unalienable right ended with approximately 700,000 enslaved people in America, more than had been enslaved in 1776. The war did not formally end with Yorktown. It took 2 more years of negotiation, complicated by the multiple parties involved, the separate British negotiations with France and Spain, the American determination to achieve British recognition of the Mississippi as the western border rather than the Appalachians, and the specific manoeuvring by which the American negotiators Benjamin Franklin, John Adams and John Jay extracted from the British government a peace more favourable than either France or Spain wanted the Americans to have. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, recognised American independence, established the Mississippi as the western boundary of the United States, and set the terms for the resolution of the various property and debt disputes that the war had generated. Britain and France signed their own peace simultaneously. The revolution was complete. The Republic had to be built. Before we assess the war's human cost, it is worth dwelling on a group whose story the American national mythology has largely suppressed. The Loyalists, the approximately 20% of the colonial population who actively opposed the revolution, and the larger number who were neither committed patriots nor committed loyalists, but who found themselves navigating a civil conflict in which neutrality was increasingly difficult and dangerous. The Loyalists were not, as the patriot propaganda presented them, the servile lackeys of British tyranny. They were people who had thought about the constitutional question and reached a different conclusion than the patriots, or who had economic and social ties to the British imperial system that they were unwilling to sacrifice, or who were members of communities, Anglican clergy, royal office holders, merchants dependent on the British commercial system, recent immigrants from Britain, members of ethnic and religious minorities who feared what a patriot majority might do with unrestricted political power, whose specific position gave them reasons to prefer the existing order. The Iroquois nations that allied with the British did so on the calculation that British imperial policy, which had tried to restrict westward colonial expansion through the Proclamation Line of 1763, was a better guarantee of their territorial sovereignty than a newly independent American republic, whose land hunger was one of the primary drivers of the revolutionary movement. The treatment of loyalists in patriot-controlled areas was often brutal. property was confiscated by state governments that passed legislation specifically targeting loyalists. Tarring and feathering, a punishment that was neither as harmless as some accounts suggest nor as deadly as others imply, but that was genuinely humiliating and genuinely painful, was applied by Sons of Liberty mobs to suspected loyalists with a frequency that the historical record preserves in detail. Social ostracism, economic boycott, forced oath-taking and physical violence were all used to enforce community conformity to the patriot cause in ways that exposed the tension between the universal rights the Declaration proclaimed and the specific coercive mechanisms the patriot movement used to secure compliance with its own authority. The approximately 100,000 loyalists who left the United States during and after the war for Canada, for Britain, for the Caribbean, included many of the most educated and most commercially sophisticated members of colonial society. The lawyers and Anglican clergy and royal office holders and merchant bankers who left took with them human capital that the new republic could ill afford to lose, and that the societies that received them, particularly Upper Canada and the maritime provinces, found enormously valuable in building colonial institutions. The Loyalist migration to Canada was one of the direct causes of the linguistic and cultural division that has defined Canadian national identity ever since, and the Loyalists claim that they had been unjustly dispossessed of their property by a revolutionary movement that invoked rights while violating them was not without some substance, even if the revolutionary position was more defensible overall. The war's human cost was substantial and unevenly distributed in ways that the national mythology has difficulty fully acknowledging. Approximately 25,000 Americans died in military service, from wounds, from disease, from the specific horrors of the British prison ships in New York Harbor, where American prisoners died at rates that made them among the deadliest instruments of the entire conflict. Perhaps 100,000 loyalists left the country during and after the war, for Canada, for Britain, for the Caribbean, among them some of the most educated and most commercially sophisticated people in colonial society, whose departure impoverished the communities they left and enriched those they went to. The indigenous nations who had allied with the British, most of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, various Ohio Valley nations, found themselves on the losing side of a peace settlement that gave away their territories without their knowledge or consent, beginning a dispossession that the succeeding century would render total. The enslaved population of America, approximately 500,000 people in 1776, whose freedom was not included in the unalienable rights the Declaration proclaimed, gained some specific individuals their freedom through military service or through the specific promises of the British commanders who offered freedom to enslaved people who escaped to British lines, while the institution that held the rest remained intact, protected by the same constitutional settlement that created the Republic. The Declaration of Independence did not end with the list of grievances against George III. It ended with a pledge. The signers mutually pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honour. The pledge was not rhetorical. Several signers lost substantial fortunes in the war. Several lost family members. At least 2 were captured by the British. A number saw their homes burned. The sacred honour part, the commitment to a set of principles they understood to be morally foundational and historically unprecedented, was perhaps the most demanding element of the pledge, because it committed them to a standard of political conduct that the subsequent history of the Republic would test repeatedly, and that they themselves would not always meet. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was the second great founding act of the American Republic, and its relationship to the Declaration of Independence is one of the central tensions in American political history. The Declaration had articulated principles. The Constitution created machinery. The principles and the machinery were not always in alignment, and the men who gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787, in the same room where the Declaration had been signed 11 years earlier, were well aware of the gap. The Articles of Confederation, which had served as the first Constitution of the United States from 1781 to 1789, had been designed by men who were deeply afraid of centralized power, having just fought a revolution against a government they considered tyrannical. The drafters of the Articles had created a national government so weak that it was barely a government at all. The Congress under the Articles had no power to tax, relying instead on requisitions from the states that the states were free to ignore and frequently did. It had no power to regulate commerce, which meant that the states maintained their own tariff walls against each other, and the commercial relations among the 13 states had more in common with relations among rival foreign powers than with the internal commerce of a single nation. It had no executive, no president, no independent administration, and its decisions required a supermajority of 9 states to take effect, making any coherent action on controversial questions virtually impossible. The specific events that revealed the Articles' inadequacy and generated the pressure for a stronger national government were varied and compelling. The British were violating the Treaty of Paris by maintaining military posts on American soil and refusing to compensate loyalists whose property had been confiscated. The national government had no power to enforce the treaty or to retaliate effectively. Spain was closing the Mississippi River to American commerce. The national government had no leverage to reopen it. The national debt from the Revolutionary War was not being serviced. Investors who had financed the revolution were not being repaid. And in 1786 and 1787, Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of western Massachusetts farmers who had been unable to pay their debts and who marched on the Springfield Arsenal in armed protest against the state government, demonstrated that the social order was not as stable as the political leadership had hoped, and that the national government had no power to intervene in a domestic crisis that threatened the republic's stability. The Constitutional Convention convened on May 25, 1787, with 55 delegates from 12 states. Rhode Island, suspicious of centralized commercial power, refused to participate. The delegates included some of the most remarkable political minds of the age. James Madison of Virginia, whose preparation for the convention had included a systematic study of every republic in world history, and who arrived with the Virginia Plan in his pocket that would become the framework for the entire subsequent deliberation. Alexander Hamilton of New York, who wanted a government considerably stronger than what the convention eventually produced, and who would spend the subsequent months writing 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers arguing for ratification of a document whose timidity he had deplored. Benjamin Franklin at 81, the oldest delegate, who said little on the floor but whose presence and occasional interventions carried an authority that no other participant could match. Gouverneur Morris, who actually wrote the final text of the Constitution in its polished form, giving it the specific cadences and the specific words that subsequent generations have quoted and analysed. The Constitution that replaced the Articles of Confederation in 1787 negotiated in Philadelphia in the same building where the Declaration had been signed 11 years earlier, by many of the same men, under the same pressure of urgency and the same awareness of historical consequence, was not the inevitable completion of the revolutionary project. It was a compromise document that reflected the specific political realities of 1787 rather than the philosophical ideals of 1776. It created a federal government strong enough to function, but not so strong that the states would refuse to ratify it. It protected the institution of slavery through the 3/5 compromise that counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation, giving slaveholding states more political power than their free population justified, through the prohibition on restricting the slave trade before 1808, and through the fugitive slave clause that required free states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners. These were not accidental provisions. They were the price of Southern ratification, understood as such by the delegates who negotiated them, including the northern delegates who opposed slavery but wanted the Union. What the Revolution established, despite the compromises, despite the gap between the Declaration's promises and the Constitution's provisions, despite the exclusions and the deferrals, was something genuinely new in the world. A government that derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that was accountable to those it governed through regular elections in a way that no previous government of comparable power had been. It established the principle that political authority was not God-given or inheritable or permanent but contingent, dependent on the ongoing consent of the people over whom it was exercised, revocable in the ballot box if not in the field. It established a written constitution as the supreme law of the land, subject to interpretation but not to casual revision. It established a system of separation of powers and checks and balances that deliberately made the exercise of political authority more difficult and contentious than a more unified system would, on the theory that concentrated power was always dangerous and divided power was at least manageable. These were not complete achievements in 1789 when the Constitution came into force. They were commitments, institutional frameworks that could be used to expand the circle of the Republic's promises or to narrow it, depending on who was using them and to what ends. The history of the American Republic in the century after the founding was the history of the argument about which use was legitimate, fought out in legislatures and courts and eventually on battlefields in ways that the founders had hoped to avoid, but that the specific compromises of the founding made difficult to prevent. The Declaration said all men are created equal. The Constitution protected slavery. The tension between those two propositions was the fault line along which the Republic's first great crisis eventually broke. The specific human stories that the Revolution produced in its most dramatic individual cases are worth a final pause before we arrive at the larger meaning. Benedict Arnold's treason is the Revolution's great cautionary tale, and its specific details are more complicated and more instructive than the simple, moral fable it became in the national mythology. Arnold had been, before his treason, probably the most effective combat commander in the Continental Army. The Quebec Campaign of 1775, the naval engagement on Lake Champlain in 1776 that delayed the British invasion and gave Washington the time he needed to survive the year, the critical tactical leadership at Saratoga. These were genuine and substantial achievements that the Congress and the Army consistently recognized inadequately. Arnold had been passed over for promotion by a Congress that was making military appointments partly on political grounds and partly on the basis of interstate rivalries that had nothing to do with military merit. He had been court-martialed on charges whose merit was questionable. He had been publicly criticized in ways he found both unjust and humiliating. He was also deeply in debt, partly because the military life he had committed to had been incompatible with the profitable merchant career he had abandoned for it. The specific decision to pass intelligence to the British and eventually to attempt to deliver West Point, the fortress commanding the Hudson Valley, to a British force was not the decision of a coward or a fool. Arnold was neither. It was the decision of a man who had concluded that the American cause was going to fail, that the French alliance was insufficient to compensate for the structural weaknesses of the Continental Army and the Continental government, and that his own interests, and perhaps the interest of the country, would be better served by a negotiated end to the war under British authority than by a continued conflict whose outcome he had stopped believing in. He was wrong about the military and political assessment, as Saratoga and Yorktown would demonstrate, but his pessimism in 1779 and 1780 was not unreasonable given what he had seen and experienced. The capture and execution of Major John Andre, the British intelligence officer who was Arnold's contact, caught in civilian clothes behind American lines with the West Point plans hidden in his boot, was one of the more genuinely tragic episodes of the war. Andre was by every contemporary account a man of exceptional personal quality, cultured, charming, genuinely admirable in his conduct as a prisoner, who had been placed in his specific dangerous circumstances, not by his own choice, but by the operational requirements of a mission that Arnold had designed. He was executed as a spy, which he technically was, with a reluctance and a ceremony that reflected the widespread recognition among the American officers who supervised the execution that he was dying for the operational mistake of travelling in civilian clothing, rather than for any action that deserved the contempt that the spy's death was supposed to express. Washington's farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York on December the 4th, 1783 was perhaps the most emotionally charged single moment of the entire revolutionary period, and the historical accounts of it are consistent in describing a scene of remarkable intensity and dignity. The officers who had served with Washington through the 8 years of the war gathered in the long room of the tavern, and Washington entered, poured a glass of wine, lifted it, and said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honourable." He then embraced each officer in turn, Knox first, as the senior, then the others in order, each one tearful, many openly weeping, Washington himself visibly struggling with the emotion that his public composure had suppressed for years. He then walked through the corps of officers without speaking, unable to, and made his way to his horse and to the journey home to Mount Vernon that he had been away from for 8.5 years. The resignation of his military commission before the Congress, which followed a few weeks later in Annapolis, was an act of political theatre. In the best sense of that term, theatre that expressed a genuine political truth, whose significance was immediately understood both in America and in Europe. George III, hearing that Washington intended to resign rather than use his military prestige to seize political power, as so many victorious generals before him had done, reportedly said that if that was true, Washington was the greatest man in the world. The king may not have actually said this, but the sentiment it expresses was genuine, and the action it was in response to was real. Washington's voluntary surrender of military power to civilian authority was the act that most concretely expressed the Republican principles the Declaration had proclaimed, and it set a precedent that the Republic he had served would follow through its generals and presidents for a very long time. What July 4th really was, stripped of the mythology and the fireworks and the formal ceremonies that subsequent generations constructed around it, was a day on which a group of men in a hot room in Philadelphia voted to ratify a document that committed them to a set of principles they had not fully worked out the implications of, in the middle of a war they were not certain of winning, in behalf of a republic that had not yet been constituted, and whose specific form was not yet determined. They were making it up as they went, which is what people in genuinely revolutionary situations always do, working from principle and improvisation and the specific constraints of the moment, trying to create something that the world had not previously seen and that they could only partially imagine. The specific men who did it were remarkable individuals in many cases. Jefferson's pen, Hamilton's financial genius, Adams's constitutional learning, Franklin's diplomatic wisdom, Washington's character. But they were also products of their time and their class and their specific interests, men who owned other people and who did not extend the liberty they valued to the people they held enslaved, who excluded women from the political life they were constituting, who dealt with indigenous nations through the same combination of treaty and dispossession that the British they had opposed had practiced. The greatness and the limitation were both real, and both a part of the honest telling of what happened. The world that emerged from July 4th, 1776, and from the 8 years of war and 7 years of political argument that preceded and followed it, was a world in which the claim that legitimate government required the consent of the governed had been staked in blood and negotiation, and an extraordinary body of political writing, the Declaration, the Federalist Papers, the constitutional debates, that gave the claim a specificity and a force that it had never before had in the history of political thought. whether that claim would be honoured in practice, and by whom, and on what terms, and over what timescale. These were the questions that the founding left open, deliberately and sometimes shamefully for the generations that followed to work out. The men who gathered in Carpenter's Hall and in the Pennsylvania State House in the summer of 1776 could not have known how long the working out would take, or what it would cost, or how the gap between the principle they were staking their lives on and the practice they were protecting would eventually force the crisis that tested whether the republic they were founding would survive. What they knew was what the Declaration says, that certain truths are self-evident, that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when any government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. They were making that argument for themselves against the British Crown. They were also, whether they intended it or not, making it for everyone else, for the generations of Americans who would invoke the same principles to demand the expansion of the Republic's promises, and for peoples around the world who would read the Declaration and hear in it a claim on their own behalf that its authors had not specifically intended. The most consequential sentence Thomas Jefferson ever wrote was the one about self-evident truths. It has been doing work that he did not design it for, in places and in behalf of people he did not imagine ever since. The night is settling in now, and the long story of American independence has reached the point where it becomes the story of what comes next. The Constitution, the first decades of the Republic, the great argument about what the Revolution had promised and to whom. That story continues. But tonight's portion ends here, in the appropriate place, with the document, and the day, and the war, and the rough and incomplete and genuinely revolutionary Republic that the whole turbulent sequence produced. Somewhere in Philadelphia tonight, there is a building where it happened. The room is preserved, the chairs arranged as they were, the light falling through the tall windows onto the wooden floor in a particular way that the summer afternoons of Philadelphia still manage. The document itself is in the National Archives in Washington, its ink faded to near invisibility after 2.5 centuries, but its words still entirely legible in the copies that have been made and distributed and read aloud for 250 years across every kind of political circumstance by people who found in them the most important promise their government had ever made. All men are created equal. It was not true when it was written. It has never been fully true in any subsequent moment, but the claim has had consequences in the lives of abolitionists who took it seriously, in the arguments of suffragists who demanded to know why it did not include them, in the courage of men and women who were not in that room and were not in that document, but who have been invoking that sentence and its implications ever since, with varying degrees of success, against the specific injustices of their specific moments. That is what July 4th really is. Not a completed fact, but an ongoing argument. Not a truth fully achieved, but a standard perpetually demanded. Not the birth of a perfect nation, but the moment at which a deeply imperfect group of human beings committed themselves and their posterity to a standard of human dignity that has been working its way through the world ever since, with enormous difficulty and enormous consequence and enormous distance still to travel. Let that settle around you now. The summer is warm tonight, and somewhere across the Republic that those men made, people are watching fireworks rise and fall against the dark sky, hearing the same celebration that has marked this day for 2.5 centuries. The Declaration is 250 years old and still making its argument. The revolution is still happening, in all the ways that matter. Rest easy.